Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started here in a couple minutes. I'm Chris Smith. I'm a member here at Englewood Christian Church. I am also the editor for the Englewood Review of Books that some of you may know about online, englewoodreview.org, if you're not familiar with it. We're delighted that you're all here tonight. We're delighted to partner with Matt and Ben and the table to host this event, and delighted to have John here with us. So with that, I think I'll just turn it over to Matt. Matt's going to be interviewing John, and then eventually we'll kind of open it up to Q&A so we can kind of all participate in a conversation together related to the book and the themes of the book.
Yes.
So
thanks, Chris.
Uh-huh.
Welcome, everybody. It's great to be with you. My name is Matt Tebby. I am one of the priests at the table. I co-priest with Ben and Spencer here, and also Ben and I co-founded Gravity Commons, and we do podcasts and training and talk about Jesus and the Bible and stuff like that. And Chris and I have been friends for a long time. We've known Englewood for over 10 years, so it's great. It's great to be here and great to have you all with us tonight. Like Chris said, we're going to be doing a live kind of podcast interview. So this is going to be, we're going to release this as an interview with John. We'll go 45 minutes or so with an interview. As we're talking, though, I invite you to write down or make a note of any questions on the note cards I was going to bring. Go ahead and
nice.
Go ahead and grab one of the pens I was going to bring too to do that. No, just track your questions because the things will come up in the middle of the conversation, and I want to make sure we capture those. So, and then we'll spend another 45 minutes or so having a larger conversation around the themes that we've discussed or themes we didn't discuss that you want to hear about. And we'll just do that kind of informally here as we go. All right. This is my friend John. John Depew is a graduate of Duke Divinity School and has served in various churches as director of education for several years. He currently works as the assistant to the chief learning officer for IPS in the Indianapolis Public Schools. And he's the author of this new book that many of you received as you came because you registered with it, or there's some to purchase back there. Beyond Justification, Liberating Paul's Gospel. John, you wrote this book with some guy named Douglas Campbell. How did you and Doug meet, and how did the idea for this book come about?
Sure. First of all, thank you all so much for being here. I'm just thrilled to see all of you sitting here and being interested in this conversation. It really warms my heart, like it honestly does. So it makes writing this book feel really worth it. So thank you, first of all. As far as meeting Doug, some guy named Doug Campbell. So I actually kind of encountered Douglas Campbell's work. He teaches at Duke. Prior to going to Duke, I was studying theology and philosophy at a little liberal arts college in Iowa prior to going to Duke. And I was taking a Paul class there and was assigned this little book called 4 Views on Paul. And Douglas contributed to that with a chapter. And I was kind of struck by it. It was different than what I had ever heard about Paul. It was just a little chapter. But it really resonated with a lot of what I was learning about Christian theology, especially the theology coming out of sort of the Eastern fathers and mothers, and really connected hands with some of the reformational thinkers that I was reading as well, and also post-Reformation, people like Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, those sorts of folks that are really sort of centered on the person of Jesus Christ as the center of the gospel story. That the revelation of God in that person is where we begin all theological thinking. And it's weird that would be different when you think about Paul's gospel.
Right.
But it kind of is. And his insights in that little chapter made me think, well, I kind of want to go where this guy is. And so I applied to Duke, where he was at.
That's why you went to Duke?
Yes.
Oh, yes, okay, cool.
Yes. Applied to Duke, got in. You don't actually get to choose who your advisors are at Duke. So providentially, I think Douglas was assigned as my advisor there.
That's great.
And so I just started following him around for 3 years. And as he'll tell you, he kind of got sick of me after the first few classes that I took with him. But yeah, and through that, we formed a really close friendship and sort of partnership in thinking about Paul, thinking about these issues together, and remained friends afterwards. He's the reason why I met my now wife, Laura. We met in a doctoral seminar that he taught. And then years later, convinced him to officiate our wedding back in 2019. So he's been involved in my life and my family's life for a long time. So first and foremost, he is my friend. He is a damn good Christian. I love him dearly. But he is also an incredibly, speaking of my wife,
I did hear that.
But yeah, so he's been a huge part of my life, and this book really came out of the what I saw with his work, which is really quite academic, really difficult stuff, especially his big book, The Deliverance of God, which is over 1,000 pages, right? Daunting task to read through. It also is quite interdisciplinary. It's dealing with things like philosophy, theology, languages, semiotics, all of these different things, and bringing them together in a really difficult way that I've, after reading it several times, finally started to understand. So there's a gap between that and what I think the importance of the book is for most people, and being able to communicate that well. So I sensed this gap. So the book came out of my sense of that gap between sort of academic theology, biblical studies, and everyday people. And I wanted to try and bridge that gap.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the impetus for the book, was that.
Yeah.
But I found this stuff important. I thought it was good. It impacted my life. I want to figure out how to get this out there in a way that's meaningful for people. So that's why it's not 1,000 pages. It's just 300.
Yes. A few things that I heard, John, that I want to just celebrate is one, it's not always the case that you meet kind of a theological hero.
Sure.
And you like them more and not less.
Yeah, the whole never meet your hero thing.
Never meet
Yeah,
there's plenty of people who the farther away from them you are, the more you benefit.
Yeah.
You know? But the closer you get, the more you're like, man, I just want the you from the book back, you know? And it's great to hear that Doug, it sounds like you grew in your admiration and appreciation for him the more you spend time with him.
Definitely.
And we need more Christians like that.
Yeah.
Lord willing. And then two, taking this, over 1,000-page book, and you had to metabolize it twice at least, right? Reading it through several times. And, it's really hard to take these brilliant interdisciplinary insights and put them on a shelf that most of us who have to do other things, but not everybody gets paid to be a Christian. We have other things we need to do with our lives. And so it sounds like then that was the impetus for this book.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, let's talk about the title, Beyond Justification.
Mm-hmm.
Justification being that I think it's an homage to justification by faith, that great insight by the reformer Martin Luther, who discovered the relief from his great turmoil and torture as a monk, right? Yeah. Everybody knows the story. And he discovered justification by faith, and it delivered him from many afflictions and tribulations. Maybe give us a brief sketch then of what justification is. What do you mean by, when you use the word justification, what are you referring to? And then what's so great about going beyond it?
Sure. Yeah. So in a basic sense, justification, it's coming from the Greek word group dikaios. It's coming from a literal Greek word that Paul uses, and word group that Paul uses. It's really talking about being made righteous, being made just, being made sort of right, being straightened out. It's another way of sort of talking about it. So most scholars talk about being justified or justification as being declared righteous or being made righteous. That I'm sure a lot of people have heard that way of talking about justification. So the sort of doctrine of justification by faith is talking about you get made righteous or declared righteous through having faith. And it's usually, famously Martin Luther, through faith alone. There's nothing else that gets you justified. Right? You just have to have faith, and then you're declared righteous, right? So that's basically what justification by faith is referring to.
Yeah.
It's this idea that through your faith in Jesus Christ, you get declared or looked at as if you're righteous. So that's kind of the basic thing. Now, why go beyond that? Because I don't think that's really the whole story in Paul. I think that's Paul uses justification language some of the time. Very few places, actually. But we tend to think as Protestants who have inherited this sort of importance of justification by faith, that this is really what everything is all about. This is what the gospel is really all about. But there's a lot more to the story. And I think that this insistence on justification by faith alone being kind of the center point is going to kind of turn you away from what I think is really the wonderful, liberative, gracious, loving gospel that Paul talks about most of the time.
Yeah. Yes, and that's the subtitle, Liberating Paul's Gospel.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is sort of a double entendre, right? We're freeing Paul's gospel from sort of being sequestered into this small category of justification by faith. And also, Paul's gospel is liberating in the sense that there's liberation at the heart of what he's proclaiming.
Absolutely. For sure. And another thing to touch on here is that justification by faith is often, in sort of the traditional Protestant way of thinking, pitted against justification by works of Torah, for works of the law, right? Not justified by works of law, but by faith.
Yes.
Right? If we take that in a certain direction that a lot of Christians have in the past, we're going to run into some issues. And we can talk about some of those issues as well.
Yeah.
But so this justification by faith kind of approach, not by works of law, is something that's really crucial here.
Okay, so before we go beyond it, and I heard you say we're going beyond it because Paul doesn't really focus on that a whole lot, even though he talks about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think in your book you talk about if you take all of the writings of Paul that scholars agree Paul wrote, that the justification sections are about 10% of his writings, and
a bit less.
And other sections are over 90, which I had never heard before, which was a little surprising to me, right? Because of how front and central it is. So before we actually go beyond here in our conversation, would you give us that old time gospel, John DePew? Would you call it justification theory in the book? And so, don't make us bow our heads and close our eyes at the end of it. But how does justification then, how is that part of a larger gospel presentation that, maybe Martin Luther and the Reformers would have been comfortable with?
Yeah. So what I do want to say is I want to be a little cautious here because I don't want to dump on the Reformation more broadly. I'm a Protestant. I think everyone here is a Protestant. Most people here, I'm sure. I don't think that this simply arises out of the Reformation. I do think that there are antecedents before the Reformation that are doing the same sort of justification kind of gospel. So I don't want to. There's a reason why we don't call it what a lot of other scholars call it, which is the Lutheran reading of Paul. There's a reason why we avoid that, because it's not that fair to Luther.
Because he's building on previous scholars too.
And I think for a lot of Luther's work, he's really into the liberative, participatory, you're gathered into Christ, you're being set free, all that sort of stuff. So it's not totally a fair account of what Luther's doing. So I want to just kind of make that a little bit clear. It does get solidified in the Reformation quite clearly, but I don't want to dump on the Reformation too hard, just to be clear. That said, let's go through this old-timey gospel. Justification theory is what we call it in the book. Theory is weird. That's a weird label. So why do we call it a theory? Justification theory. It's not principally a reading of the text. Theory is talking about a pre-understanding. It's a construct that we've been handed traditionally.
How salvation works.
Right. By certain traditions and teachers that we have been taught by through our, growing up in the church or reading certain books. It's a pre-understanding. It's a certain sort of construct first and foremost that we bring to a text and kind of see things in the light of it, right? So we call it a theory because it doesn't simply just arise out of the Bible, right? How does this theory work? What does it say? What is this theory of salvation? What is this theory of justification? The simplest way that I've found to talk about this is think about two boxes. We have this illustration in the book. So think about these two boxes, box A, box B. Box A is where everyone starts. And it starts with the individual. It starts with you. Searching for God, trying to figure out what God's like. So it's a very human-centered journey, this gospel. Starts off with the individual, searching the cosmos, searching their conscience, right? Trying to figure out what God is really like. And you do find God in this gospel, but it turns out that God is really, really irritated with you. God's real mad. So the first word you hear in this first box, box A, is a no from God. God is fundamentally looking at you in a negative way. God is really upset with you. Why is God mad? Because you have broken God's law. You've disobeyed God right away. So it's a no gospel right up front. So that's box A. Now, what happens from that? Well, you can't get out of this by yourself. You struggle away. You feel guilty because you can't obey God the way that you're expected to. You sort of go into this loop of despair, right? So that's the box A situation. It's pretty dismal, to put it mildly. And I am sure, I would bet every single dollar that I have that many of you here have heard that as the first part of the gospel. The no. God's really upset with you. That's the first thing you hear. It's a no. Now, in this gospel, there is a way out. So box B, to get into that good box, the yes from God. Luckily, God sends Jesus to die on the cross for you and absorb the punishment, the bad stuff that you deserve. And you get the righteousness that Christ has. It's usually talked about as the great exchange. I don't know if anyone has heard it put that way. You get what Christ has, and Christ gets all the bad stuff that God was looking at you as, right? So he takes on the wrath of God and absorbs that for you. Provided, this is key within this gospel, you can have access to this provided you have faith alone. You have to do something. You have to have faith. And then you get God's yes in box B. Now, think about how these two boxes are constructed. God is mad at you in box A because you failed to do things that God expects of you. It's a conditional, contractual gospel up front. It's hard, right? And you fail. Now, this other situation, this next one that gives you God's yes, it's still conditional and contractual. You still have to have faith to become a part of this, to feel God's yes to you. So both of these are structured conditionally and contractually.
Yeah.
So the basis of this gospel is conditional and contractual. It begins with this no, and you get a kind of a yes, provided you do something.
Yeah, and there's a lot more to say about this, right? There's atonement theories that play into this. There's certain,
which I was hinting at. Yep.
Certain understandings of what justice is.
Yep.
There's certain understandings of what God needs in order to forgive.
Yeah.
These kinds of logics are at work in this understanding of the gospel. I wonder, your book lays out, John, what is deficient or insufficient with this reckoning of how to understand the good news. But maybe for our purposes here, maybe could you pull out one or two places where you think that accounting of the gospel, let's call it the pre-reformational Martin Luther justification by faith gospel, one or two places where you feel like it fundamentally gets something where it was fundamentally inadequate to account for Paul's gospel?
Yeah.
Now, I know there's more than one or two.
There's a lot. I know that Doug talks about in the Deliverance of God, his big book, about 55 I think we do like 5 or 6.
Yeah.
Just like
Yeah.
get the yeah, the first thing I would say, and this is probably the most important one, is that it's insufficient on what we mean by God being love. It begins with God's no to you. God is fundamentally retributive because you didn't meet God's expectations. How in the world do you get to a loving God from that? You don't. God has affection for you once you do something, namely have faith, but God is not fundamentally love in God's very being. So how can we confess that God is love at that point?
Yeah. Can we press into that a little bit?
Please.
Because I do think one of the sort of aha discoveries for me in the last 10 years of my life is that I spent many years as a Christian not really knowing what love was.
Yeah.
I believed in it. It was really good, I think, for VBSs. But as an adult in the Christian life, I realized that my theology didn't need a clear, cogent, aligned definition of what love was and how it worked for it to function. Right? And so I think I was able to confess God is love and relate to a God that was contractual, transactional, exchangeable. Is that a word?
No, but
all right. For this
transactional,
right, and not see the disconnect. So maybe press into that a little more. What is the disconnect between God is love and if you do this, you get access to the transactional nature of it?
Yeah. How many people here are parents? How many people here are children? Everyone? That's right. So let's think about family for a second. So if you have children, or in thinking back, if you're not a parent, thinking back about your childhood, or even because I know that this can get difficult because some people do not grow up in healthy, loving families. So if that's you, that is okay. Think about the most loving relationships you have in your life. Would you call somebody loving if they said, hey, you did this thing wrong, or you did something I didn't expect you to do? I really don't like that, so I'm going to kick you out of this house forever because you did something wrong, this thing I don't like.
Yeah.
You knew better, right? Would that be loving? In no way. What happens when a child does something that deeply harms their parents or deeply harms somebody else? There's no sense in which that person is cast out forever. There is accountability. There is difficulty. There is judgment. There's wrath there too. There's anger aplenty, right? But that doesn't mean the ultimate severing of a relationship unless someone does something else to compensate for that, right?
Yeah. You're hinting at there's a covenant relationship between a parent and a child where you're committed in some sort of loyal, what you can call love, to be for their good.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think you talk about in your book, and you're alluding to it now, is that in this transaction, it doesn't take seriously enough the fidelity, God's faithfulness to God's covenant.
Yeah, exactly. So this is why familial and filial metaphors are so important to understand what God is really like as revealed in Jesus Christ, right? This is where we need to keep going back to, because we're going to be so tempted by our cultural and political context to think about God as a harsh politician, as if God's a member of Congress, right? Like, that's not how God operates fundamentally. God is a loving parent. That's what we confess about who God is. God is a loving father or mother who will never let go of God's children. And we see this, the rationale for this is in the sending of God's only beloved child to die for us while we were hostile to God. In that exact moment where there was no guarantee that things were going to work out.
Yeah.
if that's not unconditional love, I don't really know what is.
Yeah. John, I don't want to press this too much because we could take any section of this conversation and stretch it out for a long time. But there is this move made where that God's holiness or God's justice is so far beyond ours, right? That we can't even fathom the amount of offense that our disobedience causes. And often then there's that text, I think it's from Habakkuk 2? My ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Kind of, it's that sort of leveraged into that. But I think that context in Habakkuk 2 is actually talking about the way God's going to have mercy.
Yeah.
So the ways that are above his ways that are above our ways are his merciful ways, not his condemning judgmental ways. But there's also then this move to make God so God's love or God's justice is so other than ours that it's incomprehensible.
Yeah. So here's what I would say with that. We need to be thinking about where we get our understanding of what God's justice is really like. Because there is a sense in which, God's justice is higher than our justice. But we get our account of justice from Jesus Christ, from God's revelation of who God is in that person. And that person is loving, restorative, fundamentally aimed toward rescuing God's children and liberating them. Like that's the justice of God revealed there. Now, if by that people mean that God's justice being so far beyond ours turns out to be the opposite of that, which I think a lot of people do end up saying, that God can sort of do whatever God wants and that's fine, without any sort of contact with any analogy that we have from our context of what justice means,
or
then
love,
we can't actually talk about God. This is what David Bentley Hart calls the tragedy of equivocation. All theological language at that point becomes equivocal and can't actually say anything meaningful about God if God, when we mean by God's justice, when we mean by God's love, when we mean something by God being good, turns out to be something completely opposite of what we mean by good when we talk about it with reference to God, we are left without theological language.
Yes.
We're completely lost at that point. There's no contact.
Yeah.
Which is a tragedy. Yeah.
It is a tragedy. John's talking about the philosophical streams of voluntarism and nominalism. I know that those words might mean nothing to you. If you're curious about them afterwards, ask Ben Sternke about them. He'll tell you all about them. He loves that stuff. But what it does is Jesus uses the analogy, if you who are evil know how to give good gifts to your kids, how much better will your heavenly Father give you good gifts? Jesus trades on the analogical goodness between humanity and God.
Yeah.
So one of the things, John, that your book does is it gets really clear of if there's a disconnect. It's one thing to say God's love is even better than our love. It's another thing to say, which is awesome. It's another thing to say God's love is wholly other than our love.
Yes.
And we have to,
in addition to that, like the opposite of,
or the opposite, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's just 2 of 55. Is what we've just
2 of 55.
All right, let's talk about a third one.
Okay.
All right. Because you keep coming back to Jesus.
Yeah. So I'm going to do that again in a lot.
All right. Well, we'll have to just abide that, I guess. You keep coming back to Jesus, and there's a long history, and again, this isn't fully Martin Luther's fault, but he does embody it well, of some anti-Semitic, anti-Judaism readings of the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes centering revelation on Jesus is employed unto that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, then, Jews in Jesus' day had a law of works and a law of works righteousness, and they could never work enough to atone for their own guilt. And so Jesus came, they had religion, and Jesus came to offer us relationship. You heard of that one?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So how is that not what you're doing? and how is this book helping us rehabilitate a non-anti-Semitic reading of Paul?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So we're relying on scholarship coming principally from this great breakthrough that happened in the 70s. It actually has antecedents before that, but through a Duke scholar actually named E.P. Sanders, who found, going through the literature during the time of the New Testament, and he found that most Jews, when they're talking about themselves in their sacred texts, were not talking about themselves in terms of legalism, in terms of the way that the sort of traditional kind of Protestant reading was setting them up as legalistic people trying to earn their way to salvation, right? That was just a false construct. This is what Sanders found. The way that Jews during the Second Temple period were thinking about themselves and thinking about the relationship to God was what he called covenantal nomism. Covenantal nomism just refers to you're in an established covenant with God that is loving, that God has established for you. The nomism part is that God gives you expectations to follow. This isn't a punitive situation or a legal situation in terms of like law, the way that we think about it. It's kind of the way that we think about the Bible today for us. It's the presentation of sacred texts that we're enjoined to learn from and teach one another ethically in the light of, right? So it's a fundamentally positive situation. God loves you. God is in a covenant with you, and you're expected to respond to that. So this is the way that Jews, for the most part, in Paul's day and in that period, thought about what it meant to be Jewish. This wasn't a way to earn salvation. It was a way to love God and love their neighbor, right? That's what it was.
This is big if true.
Yeah, big if true. Thankfully, it is true. And so this was sort of the revolution. Now, the interesting thing is that this book was called Paul and Palestinian Judaism, that this came from. But Sanders doesn't really talk about Paul that much in the book. So you had scholars after E.P. Sanders trying to figure out how this sort of applies to the Pauline data. And I think what we're trying to do in this book is move beyond kind of some of what Sanders is doing, kind of push this forward and to see, okay, if Paul thinks fundamentally positively about Judaism, because Paul is a Jew, we need to remember that. Paul is Jewish. He never stops being Jewish, ever. There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence that he abandons the Torah, ever. There's no evidence that he expects other Jewish people who are responding to Christ to abandon their treasured practices. He thinks it's a bad thing for pagans to adopt them, for pagans converting from paganism to adopt those practices, but that's a different thing than saying that Jews need to abandon their treasured practices that were gifts of God.
I think this is a big deal, what you just said, John. To say that Paul was Jewish and not a Christian,
yes,
is kind of a radical statement to make in the imagination, because we just sort of, as Christians, we sort of claim Paul as one of us. But if we allow him to be Jewish, that puts some distance between us and Paul in a way that we're not maybe used to.
Yeah, so we're just the pagans.
Yeah, we're just the Gentiles. Yeah,
Pagans, right.
Well, so okay. So if we let Paul be Jewish, and we learn from other Jews who lived before, during, and after Jesus and Paul, that they weren't predominantly or primarily these legalistic work righteousness people. Yeah. Then John, help us out. Because we've got some texts in the New Testament where Paul is railing against things like circumcision and works of the law, right? Yep. What's going on there?
Yeah, that's the question. That is the question. I mean, it really is. So what do we do where Paul seems to be quite negative about things like works of law? What is he actually talking about there? He talks about it principally in 3 letters. He talks about it in Galatians, Romans, and Philippians.
And this, by the way, this is the 10% that you I referenced earlier, right?
Absolutely. So the only time you really get works of law, works of Torah language, is where you also get justification language as well. These are all terms that are kind of tied together, and they all really show up in Galatians, Philippians, and Romans. Okay? The clearest way that I've found to kind of get into what's going on here is through Galatians, because Paul is so explicit about what's going on here. Paul talks about in Galatians, I don't know how many of you know too much about that text, but Paul is really pissed off in that text. Normally, the way that Paul structures a letter is he has a Thanksgiving paragraph at the beginning. It's not there in Galatians. He cannot find anything to be thankful for these people because something really bad has happened there. He's really, really upset. And what we learn there is that there is a third party around that have, as Paul says, bewitched that community into thinking that they, and primarily they in Galatians are people who have converted from paganism to Christianity, that they need to be circumcised and need to follow the law. They need to do works of law. So they're being preached a gospel of works of law by a certain group of people. Now, that is a very different thing than saying that all Jews across space and time thought that what it meant to be saved was doing works of law. It is a specific group of people, a specific group of Jewish Christian missionaries that are Paul's opponents really during this time that are preaching this gospel of works of law. Okay? That's really important to not universalize this. This is a very specific group of people. Okay? This is why Paul talks about works of law, is because he's targeting this specific opponent group. It's like a rival missionary group during Paul's day. Yeah. It's like I don't know if sheep stealing makes sense here. There are people trying to take Paul's converts.
Yeah.
And they are Jewish Christians. They are. But they're a specific group, right? The mistake historically has been to say, this is what all Jews are like. When in fact, that is absolutely not what we see in the historical data. So you see these guys show up in Galatians. You get references to them in Philippians and in Romans, as we can talk about a bit more.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of the major, more contentious claim of the book.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So we're going to move into this, and we're going to probably talk another 10 minutes or so. Just want to just remind you to be writing down questions or tracking questions you have that you want to ask. We're going to have plenty of time to do some question and response together, because I know there's a lot of stuff we're stirring up here. But yeah, in the book, you actually spend a lot of time in Romans, right? I think most of us, when we've heard sermons from Romans or talked about Romans, I've come away with the impression that Romans is Paul's systematic theology. It's his magnum opus, right? It's his 1989.
Let the listener understand.
And so some people will get that. But what you're saying, John, it sounds like is Paul's not doing systematic theology. No. He's doing pastoral theology. Yeah. Why does that matter?
Another way to put that too is we got to remember here, and it's so easy to forget because we have Bibles, right, that have the text sort of in chapters, like it's part of a book. We need to remember that these are letters that Paul is sending to specific communities for specific reasons. He doesn't just send one for the heck of it, right? Or Paul didn't think he was writing scripture. He didn't. That didn't make sense for him. Scripture for him was
the Hebrew
Bible, specifically the Septuagint, the Greek version of that for him. But he was writing to address certain issues, anticipate certain issues, or to respond to certain pastoral concerns, as you said, within those communities. That's why he would send a letter. And it's usually because he couldn't be there in person, right?
Yeah.
Letters usually replaced his personal presence in a specific way. There are a few exceptions to that, though, where he just didn't want to stir up any issues because he kind of, that's a different story with the Corinthians. But for the most part, letters sort of stood in for Paul.
Yeah.
And were ways of for him to address certain problems and issues. So these are highly contingent, specific letters, right? They are packed with theology, but they're not systematic theology in the way that we think about it.
Yeah. One of the things
yeah.
one of the things you say in the book that I think is important is that Paul will start doing theology in his letters, not because he wants to do theology, but because he's trying to do this work, and the theology serves that work.
Yeah.
And so he'll say like really fascinatingly intriguing, even frustrating phrases like baptizing people on behalf of the dead, or being caught up into the third heaven, or these kinds of phrases. And then he doesn't explain them. Yeah. He just kind of moves on, and then we're left, creating denominations around them. So then in Romans,
We're really good at that. Yeah.
I mean, that's we can do that. Tonight, even you're a part of it, dude. Tonight. No, so then in Romans, why in Romans does Paul decide to talk, especially in Romans 1 and 2, and a little in 3? Why does he decide to talk there about justification, works of the law, and circumcision, and the wrathy wrath?
The wrathy wrath.
Yeah.
The wrathy wrath of God. Yeah. Well, remember what I said about Galatians and Philippians. Normally when he talks about stuff, it's because there's another party involved. I think that's exactly what's going on in Romans. We get an indication of this at the end of Romans, actually, where Paul says, if someone walks through the door with smooth talkery, being sort of really flattering you and talking in a way that's sort of like pompous, don't listen to them. He says, don't listen to them, right? Well, it would be great if we got a sense of what those people were saying. Well, that seems to be what's going on in Romans 1, because every other time in Paul's letters where he is depicting another group of people that are saying certain things that he's disagreeing with, he talks about it in terms of works of the law, in terms of this harsh kind of gospel that has nothing to do with Christ.
Yeah.
How many times does Jesus show up in Romans 1 and 2?
Less than 20.
Yeah. Romans 1:18 to 3:20. He shows up one time, and it's a passing comment. Okay,
His own gospel, right?
Yes, talking about his own
Gospel.
according to my gospel through Jesus Christ, this judgment happens.
Yes.
Right? That's weird. Okay, so where we're coming from is saying, okay, Paul's expecting someone to come through the door and do exactly what he did to his community in Galatia and sheep steal and give them this false gospel. I'm going to tell you why you shouldn't listen to them. I'm going to give you what their gospel is, give you kind of a summary. So that's what's happening in Romans 1:18 to 32. Paul is giving a summary of what this opponent's gospel is. And then in 2:1 through 3:20, Paul is going to show why this gospel does not work, why it's insufficient internally, and go on and deconstruct it. Now, you may be asking, how often does this happen in the ancient world, right? Well, it happens all the time.
It's a Socratic method,
It's a Socratic method. Kids from like an elementary school age learned how to read text this way. They were trained to see and identify when another voice was in a text. They learned how to perform text like that. And just another thing in passing, we need to also remember that letters were basically for performed speeches too. People didn't have Bibles. They didn't have a text. They were dependent upon someone performing the text to them. So the performative dimension of a text was so important during this early stage that something like a Socratic dialogue would have worked perfectly in that kind of setting. We don't really do that now. The only reading that we have is just someone reading, I'm not saying you do, reading in a monotone voice in front of a congregation.
So I can read in a monotone if you need me to.
Yeah, just reading straight through.
Yeah.
But when you're performing a text, there's drama involved. There's even physical performance involved. So it wouldn't be surprising that Paul could kind of walk into that in the way that he knew his congregants and he himself would have been trained in doing.
Yeah.
during that period. So
All right. So John just referenced that there are indications in the grammar.
oh
in,
yeah,
in the
I mean,
text.
that would be another 3 hours.
Right.
going through this.
And there's some in the book here about
Yeah.
that. That Paul is parroting
Yeah.
sort of a rival idea, and then he's going to dunk on that idea in order to what? In order to prepare them to sort of bolster their own.
Yeah, it's sort of like if a guy walks through the door talking like this is why you shouldn't listen to them.
And now you know how to debunk this.
Yes.
Sort of preparing them to like put the smack down.
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
The smackdown.
All right, so let's pivot to some question and response here,
Yeah,
John.
please.
But before we do, so obviously there's if we took Romans 1:18 through 3:20 whatever, we could spend 15 minutes on each verse talking about how the implications of these teachers' theology and how Paul differs and what grammar is being worked here and how this is it's called a speech and character.
Yeah. If I could mention something.
Yeah.
Can I grab this?
It's yours. Book, you wrote it.
I wrote it. So for those of you who have the book, on page 273, we put this in a sort of like modern style play where you can see how this back and forth kind of goes, which I'm really proud of. So if you get confused about how this kind of dialogue works, those of you who, were unfortunate enough to have to perform like Shakespeare plays growing up, we kind of laid it out like that as well.
Yeah.
So,
It's awesome. Maybe to wrap up this conversation, John, because I think I'm pretty clear on how we got this justification theory gospel is we took Paul's trying to address these opponent teachers. We took their teaching and mashed it up with Paul's teaching, and we built a Frankenstein gospel, right?
Yeah.
And what your book is doing is saying, no, let's let Paul's opponent's teaching just be over here and see the theological work Paul's doing in response to it.
Yep.
And then let's proclaim his gospel, which is in the other 90%. So maybe as we move to transition, could you just give us like a good 3-minute on what is Paul's gospel? Would you liberate that gospel, John, this evening?
With pleasure. Yeah, so the gospel according to Paul.
You call it resurrectional, participatory, and transformation.
Yes. The story, you'll see the contrast with the sort of, what do you call it, the good old gospel?
The old time.
You'll see the old time gospel, yeah. You'll see the contrast immediately because we don't start with the individual person searching for God. We begin with God revealed in Jesus Christ, who comes to search for us. It's the opposite way around. You begin with God. You begin with God's disclosure of who God really is in this person. That's where we have to start. This is where God has gifted us knowledge of God's self. We don't have to go make up a foundation for understanding what God is like. God has given it to us graciously. We need to hold on to that. Really, really do. Because so many errors can flow from resisting that because we want to be in control of it. We're not. God is the one who is disclosing what God is like. And that's a gift of love and of grace. This disclosure happens through Christ and through the Holy Spirit. So it's quite Trinitarian, we might say, or proto-Trinitarian. God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit are all sort of involved in this disclosure of who God is and what God is really like. And what we learn there in this disclosure is that God, from before all ages, from before the foundation of the world, has purposed to create a people, a loving fellowship of people, to live together with God and one another for forever in perfection and fellowship. This is God's fundamental purpose for all things. And it's fundamentally positive. It's the yes right up front. It's not the no gospel up front. Remember? Box A gospel was no. God is mad at you. This begins with God's yes. God is the purposes of creation and God electing us to be with God is positive. It comes from God's love and God's generosity. Now, we know that something has gone wrong. we can look around and see the brokenness and fractured nature of our cosmos. We can sense it. We don't have perfect understanding of what's really gone wrong on our own, but you can look around and see broken relationships. You can see the way that our world is so fragile and decaying in front of us, and we're decaying, right? There's something wrong that's trying to take this plan of perfection and fellowship and life off track. God responds, though, not by introducing a new plan that says, oh, that one didn't work. My purpose is for creation. This love, it didn't work. I'm going to try something else. No, God is going to bring that initial plan back on track. And the way that God does this is by sending his only beloved child into that situation in the incarnation to take on all of that brokenness in the precise likeness, Paul says in Romans 8, of sinful flesh. So our flesh has been contaminated by this problem. Christ comes in the precise likeness and takes it on and bears it faithfully to the cross. So he bears all that we are. And the reason why we call this participatory is because we're right in there. Through the Spirit, Christ has assumed what we are, and we participate in Christ as well. So what happens to Christ happens to us. It's amazing. Think about the intimacy there. There's nothing sort of external or transactional happening apart from us that we have to link up to. It's happening to us intimately. So Christ bears what we are and dies on the cross. So as Paul says, Christ's death is our death. Christ died, therefore all have died. Right? So this situation that Christ has assumed, this negative stuff that's so damaging, so harming, so bad, has been executed on the cross. It's done away with, it's dead, it's buried. Thankfully, that's not the end of the story. What happens? Yeah, he gets raised, which is great. The story doesn't end in death, right? It doesn't just end at the cross. What happens is Christ is raised by the Spirit. God raises Jesus from the dead. And just like we were included in Christ's death, Christ assumed what we are, we also are raised with Christ. Christ's resurrection is our resurrection. We're in him, right? So Christ gets a new transformed reality, and we too in him are transformed and liberated from our enslaved and damaged condition, right? Where we can now live forever. Think about how this connects back to God's original plan. What was God's original plan? To create a fellowship of people to live in loving communion with each other. Something went wrong. God corrects that and heals it and liberates us out of that. Now we're in the plan that God had set in place from before all ages. It comes right back around, right? So creation, redemption, the final consummation of all things are all tightly connected there. Hallelujah.